have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged.
If you're listening to this, you are the resistance. The resistance.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. It's a trap!
Hello and welcome back, Truth Seekers. I'm here today with the one and only Dr. Sebastian Gorka of the GorkaBriefing.com, as well as ThreatKnowledgeGroup.org. You'll come for the accent, but you'll stay for the wisdom. Dr. Gorka, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
I know you've been quite busy on the television lately. I appreciate you carving out some time to come visit me on the YouTube. But a couple things I want to start with. First of all, whoever's listening, go out and buy this book immediately. It's called Defeating Jihad, The Winnable War. Best book I've read in a long time, and it's going to clear your perspective on exactly what the war is that we're fighting and what we can do about it. Doctor, is there any way we can get a copy of this to President Obama, maybe Lady Hillary and some of their associates, just to kind of clear up the confusion?
We could try, but I doubt it would have any effect. It would be like broadcasting on FM to somebody who's got an AM receiver. Waste of time. Waste of time.
So your bio is pretty extensive. In terms of what you do for the government, who you lecture, who you meet with, can you kind of give us the 30-second condensed vision of that so people can understand what specifically your, what your job is in terms of who you advise?
Right. So I specialize in the strategic culture of jihad. So getting inside the mind of groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Nusra, people like Omar Mateen, the recent terrorist who detonated devices in New York and New Jersey. And the people who want to know about that are the U.S. military, elements of the intelligence community, and also our police, our federal police, state and local. So I'm on the road every week, mostly in front of people from Fort Bragg, the Green Berets, U.S. Special Operations Command, the U.S. Marine Corps, and police audiences across the nation.
So originally we were going to talk last week, and since that time, I've got all these notes from your book. I really want to cover some of the highlights. But in the time between then and now, we've had 3 terrorist attacks on American soil. We've had the press secretary say that this is a war of narratives and that we've debunked the narrative. We've had Chris Hayes say that he was relieved that no guns were used in these attacks, although guns were used to take down the terrorists, fortunately. The person who found the second bomb thought it was a science experiment, maybe a clock, I'm not sure. If it had been a clock, I'm sure everything would have turned out fine. And Obama has come out and said that ISIS is a failed cause, their ideology is being undermined, and Iraq and Syria are places where they're losing ground, despite the fact that we're being attacked here at home. If I was a Martian from outer space, can you explain to me what exactly is going on here?
Yes, very simply. America and the West is in mortal danger from something I like to call the global jihadist movement. It is an organizational conspiracy that has been going at least for 90 years in its modern form since the Muslim Brotherhood was established in 1928. If you look at the last 7 years, we have been increasingly losing it. Duke University, which is not a hotbed of crypto-conservatism, published a report last year called Muslim American Involvement in Violent Extremism. All of your viewers can download it. Just look at Figure 1. Figure 1 should be an eye-opener to everybody. Since they have collected information on every jihadi plot in America since 9/11. 2015, by far, saw the highest number of jihadi plots on U.S. soil since that awful day 15 years ago. So the bad guys are winning. One last data point for anybody who wants to drink the Kool-Aid of, they're on the ropes and they're the JV team. A couple of data points. According to Site Intelligence Group, that's SITE, excellent counterterrorism website, since June the 2nd of this year, outside of Iraq and Syria, so outside the war zone, there has been a jihadi attack every 83 hours. Not 83 days, every 83 hours. Let's bring it back home. Let's talk about America. With the recent arrest just now in New Jersey, we have seen in the last 2 years, since the caliphate was declared by ISIS from the Grand Mosque at Mosul, 112 people linked to ISIS arrested or killed in America. Not 12, not 32, 112. from all over the country. If you prorate that by month, we are arresting 300% more ISIS suspects in America per month than Al-Qaeda suspects. So I'll let your viewers decide for themselves based upon the empirical evidence. Do they feel safer or not?
In your book, you mentioned this is the longest war, most protracted war the United States has ever fought. And despite what Brother Obama says, we've never been weaker in terms of our position in this war. I mean, Iraq and Syria, they're losing ground. Didn't we control Iraq a couple of years ago? 100%? Help me understand. The math's fuzzy for me. Maybe I'm just a guy from the sticks.
The trouble is that there's a narrative that has to be maintained that's coming out of the White House. And if you countermand that narrative, you will get in trouble. Last year, it was leaked that 60 Central Command intelligence analysts complained that their analysis of ISIS was being doctored, censored, or lost. Why? Because the White House wanted to hear that ISIS is losing, that we're winning. And when the analysts looked at the ground and said, look, they're not, they're actually expanding, that analysis, if it didn't match the preconceived political requirements, was doctored or was lost. We had problems, serious problems, during the Vietnam War, but we never had 60 analysts say they were being censored. So it's not about reality. You have to understand, for this administration and for the left and the commentariat, it isn't about reality. It is all about spin.
So one more question before I pull this back to your book. You mentioned in an article that I read about leaders high up in authority, if they ask the wrong questions or suggest the wrong answers, they find the door and they're no longer involved in the hierarchy. How high are you allowed to go? Because you haven't been afraid to say these, slay these sacred cows.
Well, look, I'm in a very enviable position. I left government service 2.5 years ago. I am free to speak my mind, so I've gotten it to the very top of the military. So I've briefed the commandant of the Marine Corps before he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I briefed regularly 3-star generals. I briefed the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So when it comes to the war fighters, the men in uniform, the people at the sharp end, there's really limited obstacles. But the issue is the people above them in the expensive suits. I haven't been invited to the White House. This may shock you, but I don't expect to be, because I'm not going to tell them the things they want to hear in advance. So there is clearly a filter. There's that famous glass ceiling that Hillary shattered. Well, there's still a cast iron ceiling inside U.S. government, and it doesn't apply to sexual equality. It applies to the reality of the threat we face as Americans.
Yeah, I think for regular average Joes like me who don't live and work in D.C., we wonder, where does the information transfer stop? Where does it become one-way traffic? Where's the missing link, right? Evolutionary speaking. So in the book, a lot of stuff to cover here. You started in the prologue, or the preface, with your story about growing up during the communist takeover of Hungary. Fascinating read. Buying the book is worth it just to listen to your story. And when I read it the second time, I thought there was when Colin Kaepernick was getting news. It hasn't stopped, and I thought, why is it that wealthy, privileged Americans won't salute our flag, but people who come from a background like yours can't possibly conceive of saluting any other? Which flag should Colin Kaepernick be saluting? Which one are you willing to kneel or to salute?
To be clear, that's my father's story. So I was born and raised in the UK after my parents escaped communist Hungary. And it's their experience. It's my father being imprisoned for being an anti-communist at the age of 20 with a life sentence. It's their horror story from behind the Iron Curtain that put in me an understanding as somebody born in a free society that liberty, I realized so early on that liberty is as precious as it is valuable. And Ronald Reagan was absolutely right. And this is what, rich football players need to understand. The loss of liberty is always just one generation away. And America is unique. It is the greatest nation on God's green earth, in part because it is the only nation that was created based upon the principles of liberty and freedom and the rights of the individual. It wasn't created based upon a linguistic community, some royal dynasty, or some geopolitical, accident of fate. It was based upon the founding fathers putting those principles, those objective truths, into our revolutionary documents that created this nation. So, I know your question was a rhetorical one, but yeah, I think I'm not ashamed to say this. As a proud American today, I think I understand what America represents, often in ways that my fellow Americans who were lucky enough to be born here, didn't have to choose America, don't necessarily see things. So I think the immigrant's perspective can sometimes give you a clarity that is otherwise perhaps lacking.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people who had the experience of your father. It was Paul, correct? Was his name?
Yes.
And that was a shared experience among people that lived behind the Iron Curtain. And I remember in grade school hearing one of the last surviving Auschwitz prisoners speak at our school, if you want to call it that. It was communication issues, but getting to feel that experience. And kids today are hearing speakers from the social justice movement. They're hearing transgender activists speak in school. And there's a wealth of this knowledge from what it's like to live without liberty that's just not being valued or shared. It's amazing to me as I read Paul's story.
Yeah, look, it's all part and parcel of this narrative. America is the problem. So this is, forget the conspiracy theories. All these people talk about, well, you know what God, President Obama really prays to. Just forget that. The fact is, Dinesh D'Souza nailed it in his article about the president 7 years ago. We are living in an age where we can have a president elected to the highest office of the free world, and he doesn't believe in America. We are the problem. That's why you have the apology tool. That's why you have a statement like this. I believe in American exceptionalism the same way the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism and the Brits believe in British exceptionalism. That statement means there is no such thing as exceptionalism if everybody's exceptional. So this is the postmodern, secular, relativist ideology as government policy. And this is where we get the whole social justice movement. This is where we get the intolerance, the left-wing intolerance that, people like, a gay British libertarian like Milo Yiannopoulos is banned from speaking at liberal colleges because he doesn't agree with the social justice propaganda. How does that happen in America? I thought we have freedom of expression, First Amendment rights. So these are deep, deep issues that touch upon the essence of what it means to be an American. And people need to wake up, really, quite frankly.
I also thought it was interesting that he chose Greek. He had big stones to do that at the time when Greek was collapsing on its own weight. Right. Talk to us quickly about how that experience set the tone for the rest of your book. It almost seems out of place if you read about that story, but the book is about jihad.
Right. So the first chapter, the prologue of my book, is about my family background, their experience of communism. And it sounds weird because the book is entitled Defeating Jihad. And it's a book about the jihadi threat to America. Interestingly, whenever I meet people who've read the book, all they want to talk about is the first chapter. They love this chapter.
That's
and they say, you got to make a movie out of it. Why is it there? For a very simple reason. When I watched those planes hit the World Trade Centers 15 years ago, I understood them a little bit differently from most Americans and I think most people in the West. For me, that wasn't just an act of terrorism. For me, it was the return of the totalitarians. I actually call groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, the Islamic State, people like Major Nidal Hassan, the Tsarnaev brothers from Boston, I call them the new totalitarians. Why? Because there's a connective tissue between the fascists and the Nazis of World War II, between the communists of the Cold War and the jihadists of today. And that connective tissue is totalitarianism. One group worshipped the class, okay? One worshipped race, and this group worships their creator as they see it. But the bottom line is the same. If you disagree with them, there is no negotiating. They will enslave you or they will kill you. And that is why the lessons of the Cold War are so incredibly important, in my opinion, to our approach as to how we're going to win this war against a new group of totalitarians.
Well, then let's talk about that and some of the major story arcs in your book. The first one being the long telegram. What is it? Why is it important?
Right, so I cheat. I look at our solution for the current fight as being based upon a template that was incredibly successful. And it's two documents from the Cold War, two secret documents that have been declassified, and I actually reproduce in the appendices of the book in their original form. This first one was a very famous secret telegram written by an American diplomat called George Kennan in 1946. He was asked by Washington to explain what's going on in Moscow. Why is Uncle Joe not so friendly anymore? And he sat down. He was an expert on Russian history and the Soviet Union. And he wrote a 14-page telegram that is just superlative. It is the quintessence of what is communism, what is this totalitarian ideology, and why it represents an existential threat to America and to the free world. That's what I call the enemy threat doctrine. That document was later published pseudonymously as the Sources of Soviet Conduct in Foreign Affairs, a very famous article in 1947. And then it became the foundation for President Truman's declaration of the Truman Doctrine, that we would help people fighting communism anywhere. And on top of that, here comes the flip side. After the Truman Doctrine was declared, a genius strategist called Paul Nitze in the State Department was tasked by President Truman. Look, here's the enemy. Kennan has described for us the enemy. It's communism, the Soviet Union. Give us a game plan to defeat the Soviet Union. And he wrote the top secret document, National Security Council Memo 68, NSC 68, which again was an incredible strategy for how to destroy the Soviet Union's ideology from the inside and how to strengthen Western civilization. Those two documents, the analysis of the enemy ideology and the game plan on how to delegitimize them, I use that as my template for the current threat, and that's really the meat of my book, Defeating Jihad.
And one of your first points in there was naming the enemy, something that we refuse to do at those high suit levels. Talk to us about some of the points you make in terms of why that's important.
Right. So my game plan for the next president on how to defeat our threat is very simple. It's a three-legged stool. Part one of the plan is get politics out of the threat assessment. No political censorship, no political correctness. If the enemy says they are jihadis, you don't get to change that. You don't get to say, no, they're unemployed, they're uneducated. You don't get to do what happened. Remember what happened after San Bernardino? For more than a week, there was this push, this desperate push in the media amongst the liberal politicians to say, yeah, nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with Islam. This guy was a repressed closet homosexual who was taking out his revenge on a Latin lover by killing people in that nightclub.
Perfect sense. I get it.
There's reality. It's in your face, but you're going to generate this falsehood that the FBI completely debunked. Look at what happened even later. The transcripts are released by the Department of Justice, in which he tells the 911 dispatcher, as he's mowing down his fellow Americans, I am doing this for the Islamic State. Allah is great. I am a jihadi. I am part of the caliphate. What does DOJ do under the direction of the Attorney General? Deletes or changes any reference to Islam or jihad. When he said in Arabic, Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest, the Department of Justice changed the word Allah to God. Now, you don't get to do that with raw intelligence. That's called the perversion of the intelligence cycle. So rule number one, no politics in the threat assessment, no political correctness, no censorship.
And let me stop you right there, because you wrote that Bush made a huge mistake ignoring the Jordanians and Egyptians' advice of calling jihadism what it was, because he didn't want to offend Muslims. And you also said that Saddam Hussein was not a caliphate guy, and he wouldn't have used deadly weapons. Did they know this at the time? Like, I get if the public doesn't know it, but what did they know and when did they know it?
Look, I don't want to relitigate the first, operations after 9/11, but the fact is, I'm a bipartisan critic. Obama's policies have been catastrophic, but the Bush administration made some huge errors. The facts are the facts. Saddam Hussein was evil, pure evil. He's the only man in history outside of Adolf Hitler to use chemical weapons on his own population. Just Google, Halabja massacre. So this is a fact. Getting rid of him is a good idea in general because he's evil. But to say I'm getting rid of him because he might give weapons of mass destruction to Al-Qaeda, that's just absurd. There is evidence. You can read the testimony of the amazing Tom Joslin from the Long War Journal. He's testified in front of Congress. There was tactical level assistance. So Saddam Hussein's security services provided tactical level assistance to Al-Qaeda. But the idea that a guy who models himself on Stalin, this is, Saddam Hussein, models himself on a secular dictator, is going to give weapons of mass destruction to a fundamentalist religious jihadi who hates him, not justifiable. As a result, we could take down Saddam Hussein if we justified it on the basis of him being an evil guy. But to justify it on the basis of he's going to give WMD to Al-Qaeda, it's bogus.
Yeah, and I think I just read on your Twitter feed, you posted something about how we shouldn't have been surprised by these bombings. If you're paying attention, you should be expecting this. You wrote in your book that we should have been ready for 9/11. Right. I see a corollary here of the people at the highest head of government. You expect them to understand the things that you're talking about. And that's the point I'm making. Do they or do they not understand it?
They don't and they can't for two big reasons. Number one, they've drunken the Kool-Aid of an analysis about 6.5 years ago that terrorism is the result of poverty and lack of education. This is an article of faith. Terrorism comes from poor people who've been dispossessed, are stupid, uneducated, and are poor. Now, if lack of education and poverty resulted in terrorism, half of India would be terrorists. But they're not. What's missing? It's the thing you can't talk about, the ideology. And you can't talk about the ideology because in this case, it's a religious one. And if you talk about the Islamic ideology of jihadis, you are undermining the one world kumbaya, a relativist, multicultural narrative on which the left is built. So there's this inbred inability to talk about the truth because otherwise it undermines their worldview. And then lastly, there's a kind of bigger philosophical one. The sad truth is that a lot of people on on Capitol Hill in Washington, even on the right, unfortunately, don't take religion seriously. If they say they have faith, they may go to church at the weekend, they may go to temple, but in most cases, they see themselves as a sophisticated, postmodern guy or gal. And for them, going to church or temple is a cool networking tool. Over coffee and donuts afterwards, I'll schmooze. Now, if you don't have personal faith, I realized this about 3 years into the war. I don't care if you're a Buddhist or a Zoroastrian or a Hindu or a Christian, I don't care. But if you don't have faith, if you don't understand the power of the transcendental, you will never understand our enemy. You won't even begin to understand the concept of a suicide bomber. So as a result, we have a political elite that simply cannot understand the stakes of this war and what our enemy believes.
Excellent. And in terms of the philosophy that the followers buy into, something that you talked about in the book, and I've read your articles about the enemy masterminds, And so if I get in an argument with someone who's an atheist, and I say, well, you like Harris and Dawkins, or if they're an Alinskyite because they like, that's Obama and Clinton, you have to look at the people that have intellectually mentored them. So when you talk about Abdullah Hazam and Saeed Gateb, sorry, I'm saying these names wrong, Iman al-Zawahiri, Brigadier General S.K. Malik, if I were to say these names to anyone who hadn't read your book, they would just blank stare. And I imagine that happens in government a lot. Tell us about why it's important to understand the philosophies of the intellectual mentors who are distributing the doctrines of jihad.
Very simply, because Sun Tzu was right. If you want to win a war, you have to know yourself and you have to know your enemy. The jihadists aren't random. They don't just make stuff up as they go along. They follow a game plan. If you go to our war colleges, if you go to West Point, if you go to the Naval Academy, if you go to the War College, what are you going to study? You're going to study the masters of Western military strategy. You're going to study Napoleon, Clausewitz, Mackinder, Boyd, so on and so forth. Well, guess what? The bad guys have their own Clausewitzes, their own Napoleons, and they're the names you mentioned, Qutb, Azam, Malik, and the leaders of Al-Qaeda over the years. These individuals have written books on how to destroy us. And if you don't read them, you don't understand. You don't know what's happening next. And the bad guys have read these books. And if they've read them, you need to read them if you want to defeat them.
What would you give advice in the book when you talk about how in Vietnam we basically measured our success in the war by the body bag count? Let's talk about winning the war against jihad. Let's close out with what us regular citizens do and what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, in your opinion, as the expert on the subject.
Right. So we talked about the first leg of the plan. The last two parts, number two, we have to understand this isn't a war with Islam, because remember, what was the religion of the fighter pilot in the cage that was burnt alive? He was a Jordanian Muslim. This is a war inside Islam that is also targeting Christians, Yazidis, Jews, you mention it. But because it's a war inside Islam, who do we want to be the face of it? Not white-skinned or brown-skinned Americans. We want our Muslim allies in the region, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, also the Kurds. We have to help them create a real coalition, not this false Potemkin alliance that the Obama administration keeps talking about, which doesn't exist, a real one. They have to trust us. They don't trust us right now. We have to help them close with and crush the enemy. And the last part, the long-term victory is not, you're absolutely right, it's not measured in body bags, okay? Killing terrorists is great. I'm all down for killing terrorists. But it's a bad metric. Body bags was a stupid metric in Vietnam, not much better a metric today. In the war of the flea, this is what they call it, the irregular war, the kinetic is less than 25%. The larger part of this war is the point at which young men and women don't want to become jihadis. And how do you do that? You destroy their message. You destroy the brand. Just like the Gipper, just like Ronald Reagan destroyed the brand of communism. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. You run an evil empire. We have to do the same thing with jihad today. And of course, again, not people like me, mostly our allies and our partners, assisted by a giant, covert counter-propaganda campaign. That way, we delegitimize the message, fewer people want to become jihadis, and eventually we put a stake through the heart of this new totalitarianism.
What's Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb? I had this note written down. What does that mean?
So this is how the jihadis look at the world. They divide the world into two types of territory: Dar al-Harb, the house of war, and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Islam is the territory that is under Muslim control, is the caliphate, and is governed by Sharia law. That is how a Muslim should live, in the house of Islam. The Dar al-Harb is any territory which is under infidel control and which must be captured for Dar al-Islam. So the caliphate exists, but the caliphate must always expand until it covers the world. So it's their very binary vision of how the world is divided.
As citizens, this kind of an add-on to the last question, as regular people who live here, who are coming to understand this 1,500-year-old or older war that's been going on, what do we do as regular people? Not just to protect ourselves, but to help.
Right. So this is the first appendix to the book, and I open it by saying very simply, you don't have to wear a uniform, carry a badge or a gun. Every American has a role to play, because the front line isn't 8,000 miles away in Mesopotamia. The front line is when you leave your door, when you leave your house in the morning. It's in that office complex where they had a Christmas party in San Bernardino. It's in that food court in St. Cloud at the weekend. That's where the front line is. So what do you have to do? Number one, you are obliged to educate yourself and everybody around you. Buy a Quran. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Find out from the primary source what this religion is about and how it can be exploited. Educate yourself on what the enemy believes and tell the people around you, look, take religion out of the equation if you want. Just say the following. It's about the U.S. Constitution. I don't care if you're a member of the KKK or a communist or a jihadi. If you have values that are counter to the U.S. Constitution, you are a threat to all Americans, period. And then lastly, a very simple observation that, is controversial for some, but I truly believe it. If you live in a jurisdiction that permits the licensed carry of concealed weapons, and if you think you have the mental fortitude to do so, acquire a license, get training, and be in a position to protect yourself and your loved ones. Why? Because there is no front line in this war. If one person had had a concealed carry permit in San Bernardino or Orlando, that would have been a very, very different story. Look at what happened in St. Cloud. An off-duty police officer, not from that jurisdiction, had a concealed weapon on his person. What happened? He neutralized the threat. So if you have the mental fortitude to do so, think about it. But if you don't, even so, educate yourself.
Well, Dr. Gorka, I think, sadly, you're going to stay very busy for the next few years, if not indefinitely. If someone's unfamiliar with your work, should they sign up for, aside from buying the book, which I'll link to, should they sign up for an email list? Is it Facebook? Is it Twitter? Where can they get the most of you that's possible?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on social media. I'm pretty maxed out on Facebook, but on Twitter, I'm on it all the time. It's at Seb Gorka, so that's SEBGORKA, at Seb Gorka. And then if you want regular updates for everything I do, just go to my website, lots of free material. That's thegorkabriefing.com, and it has the word the in it. So THEGORKA briefing.com, thegorkabriefing.com. All my regular media hits, or all my analysis. There's even 12-part video lecture on ISIS. And if you can't get the book, Defeating Jihad, the strategists that you mentioned, Azam, Qutb, Malik, their works are on my website. Download them for free, read them, prepare, educate yourself.
Fantastic. I was really excited about having you on, and you did not disappoint. Thank you, sir, for all the work that you do, and good luck out there.
My pleasure. God bless.
You're listening to the absolute unadulterated truth, courtesy of the Oh Hail Yeah Show. Want more? Oh. Hail yeah, you do.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the Young Cons podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud. And make sure to check us out online at youngcons.com/podcast. Or chat us up on Twitter at RealTJHale.
But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.